The government has expanded its definition of extremism amid a rise in Islamist and far-right protests. The change was announced earlier by the Communities Secretary, Michael Gove.
The proposed definition will hold that extremism is the promotion or advancement of an ideology based on violence, hatred or intolerance that aims to negate or destroy the fundamental rights and freedoms of others, or undermine, overturn or replace the UK system of liberal parliamentary democracy and democratic rights, or intentionally create a permissive environment for others to achieve these results. It is important to stress that we are in no way intending to restrict freedom of expression, religion or belief.
Well, critics say the new definition does risk penalising law-abiding citizens and curbing civil liberties. Joining us to discuss this is commentator Charlotte Littlewood, a former counter-extremism coordinator for the government. And, of course, we're still joined by Dr. Alan Mendoza. Charlotte, I mean, I know we've had conversations between us. You've sort of told me a lot. I was staggered by some of the information you gave me about some of the groups operating and quite who they're giving advice to. And I think that what Michael Gove is intending to do today is to flush that system out. What did you make of this announcement?
So I think we're focusing a lot on whether or not this is really a new definition at all. I don't think that this is really a broadening, but rather a reframing of the definition we've already had to focus more on the ideological perspective rather than the ends of the British values. But either way, you end up at a position where you look at hateful groups that promote intolerance and inequality and threaten our democracy. So we have, I would say, workably a very similar definition on a practical sense. What I think is really interesting about what Michael Gove has said is he's actually going to share with us the list. And now let us not be fooled, the list already exists. I've worked with the list. But the list will now become something that is public. It will be refreshed. There will be a new look at the evidence. There will be a patient look, as he said, at the evidence at hand and whether this satisfies extremist organizations as a definition. Now, with that in place, that really will practically help in one small section of tackling extremism. And that is the funding of, supporting of, and allowing of extremist organizations into positions of political influence. To give a case example, when I was working as a counter-extremism coordinator, the short-lived time when we had counter-extremism coordinators, I was trying to disrupt events being held by an organization held on the list, which I'm sure will soon be released. And I was frustrated from doing that because it was considered to be politically inconvenient. So what this will do is it will, by exposing the list publicly, it will mean it's far more difficult to prevent the work from actually being done. It will make the work more implementable, and that is really important.
Charlotte, these are some of the organisations that Michael Gove listed. They are the Muslim Association of Britain and the British wing of the Muslim Brotherhood. Also, these are extreme right-wing organisations, I think, the British National Socialist Movement and Patriotic Alternative. Is he on the right track with those organisations? Is he right to cite them as potentially dangerous to British values?
I wasn't aware of the latter one there, but the first two, absolutely. These are organisations that have been set up by those with links to the Muslim Brotherhood. Kamal Halbawi set up the Muslim Association of Britain. And the Muslim Brotherhood's pure goal is to ideologically indoctrinate and bring about a caliphate, albeit democratically. But their idea is to ideologically indoctrinate the countries in which they arrive and set up institutions. And in fact, you could kind of consider them ideological migrants. And these are kind of the people, the organizations, the thinking that we really need to be focusing on.
I mean, the Muslim Brotherhood, as I understand, is an organisation that is prescribed or booted out of various Muslim countries even. It seems to me that a lot of these organisations have very innocuous names. They sound like they're doing good things and they're here to build community relations, but might indeed have some pretty eyebrow-raising connections and, as you alluded to earlier, find themselves in positions of political influence, such as, for example, giving the police advice on what is or isn't Islamophobic. How prevalent is this, do you think, in public society, that you do have sort of organisations with pretty suspicious connections who are actually the ones giving advice to politicians and to public services?
Yes, well, you've got Alan Mendoza there with you, who has a report within his organisation, the Henry Jackson Society, that is about charities that are dressed up in sheep's clothing, but they're actually extremist organisations. And that looks at a number of different organisations that will receive donations, set up charitable status, but actually they're about promoting hate, supporting Hamas. One such organization, which has been mentioned, I think by Michael Gove already, Cage, actively involved itself in disrupting interventions for those that were becoming radicalized. And I know from my time within the Home Office within Prevent, an active case was disrupted, and that person then did not continue having their de-radicalization sessions and went to join ISIS and died in Syria. So these are the kind of organizations we're dealing with.
Charlotte, so we are. Let's bring Dr. Alan Mendoza in on this. This new definition will apply but not criminalise groups that promote an ideology based on violence, hatred or intolerance. I find the violence bit a bit strange, because surely if you are promoting violence, that is a crime. You know, as I was saying to Alex earlier, I'm an absolutist on free speech. I don't buy all this stuff about language is very important. It's our language, we can use it. If it offends people, hey, suck it up. However, if the language you are using is a call to inflict harm on other people, obviously the law has to come in there. You can't have that. So I'm a bit dubious about this violence bit. Hatred and intolerance, I think we have to accept. That's not necessarily a crime, to hate or be intolerant. But on a more general basis, Alan, do you fear that this new definition may infringe on freedom of speech?
Well, it might do. I think, you know, Michael Gove has rightly said, I don't intend it to. This is my plan, is to preserve free speech and to put this out in definitional form that I think will protect it. But it's interesting. You talk about hatred and intolerance, for example. Well, your version of hatred and intolerance might be different to mine, or might be different to the third person's. What if the person doing the interpretation believes that this show is promoting hatred and intolerance, for example, and will say that it's on every day, there's a repeat pattern, and hateful views are expressed in this point? In theory, at least, in theory, you can see a situation where the label of extremism could be put on this show, for example, or many other people unintentionally caught in. And that, I think, is a problem with woolly phrases. Violence, we all understand. We get violence because it's either violent or it isn't. There's no real midway. Hatred and intolerance are subjective criteria. There are other things in the definition. That you look at, you know, fundamental rights, for example. What are these fundamental rights? I mean, I'm curious what those are. So definitionally, what are they? And if we don't understand what they are, can they be reinterpreted? Let's imagine a different government came in with a different view on these things. Will that new centre of excellence, therefore, change its criteria for interpretation to look at this? So I'm worried that, number one, we're going to miss out on some of the groups now because there's going to be wrangling about the interpretation. I'm also worried that down the line, there will be a different set of criteria applied to the interpretation, and the whole definition could become a political hostage.
And do you think this could be, perhaps Charlotte, you can think about this as well, but you first, Alan, is this going to end up being a field day for lawyers? Because if you bring some alleged terrorist into the dock...
Every day is a field day for
well,
lawyers.
yeah, but of course. But you bring an alleged terrorist into the dock, and the prosecutors go, you are guilty of hatred, you are guilty of intolerance. The lawyer's saying, well, what is hatred? You know, what do you hate? How can you define? The lawyers are going to do well out of this, aren't they?
Well, we've already seen that's likely because, you know, we've been told that the Secretary of State's view is final on this subject, but there will be judicial review possibilities. If the whole thing gets ruled ultra vires, that's a massive blow for the government, number one. Number two, I should point out there are, of course, dangers in the groups taking the case to court. If it is confirmed in law, for example, that they are extremist, that becomes a much bigger problem for them. Right now, there's this sort of grey area, isn't it? Well, the government says you're extremist. Well, the next government might change its mind on that. But if it's defined in law that you then fail, well, then, frankly, you are going to be labelled as extremist. So I think that does work both ways, but the lawyers win either way. They get their day in court.
Yeah, I really should have gone into the law business. Charlotte, your views on that?
I've got a question for Charlotte.
OK, well,
because I
go
think,
on, then.
yeah, no, because what I wanted to ask is I think that what this reveals, the fact that you've actually got a situation now where the government's having to name and say these organisations won't be taxpayer funded and they'll be on a list where if public bodies are working with them, eyebrows will be raised and they'll be advised not to. It suggests to me that we were in a right pickle and had all sorts of ne'er-do-wells in all sorts of positions they shouldn't have been in.
Absolutely. And we've covered this before, how money has gone to the wrong organizations and hasn't gone to the right organizations. And we've seen organizations like the Quilliam Foundation, which was predominantly Muslims working together to tackle extremism, were not funded adequately and became now no longer working. But I really wanted to look at the fear around this definition, because I do think it's not necessarily warranted, as this is not a piece of legislation we're looking at. This is no different to the last definition that we had that was not able to be imposed by law. We're not going to be seeing people being ruled in court as extremists or arrested for being extremists. We have terrorist legislation for terrorism, and this is extremism. So it's a definition, it's a benchmark, it's something that can be used, yes, to create a list that says this is where government money should be going. This is questionable whether these organizations should be able to have charitable status. It's questionable whether they should be able to have legitimate platforms for political reach and influence. It's a way to name and shame organizations so that they don't get that kind of platforming. It's not something that I see will be turned into legislation in the same way as we grappled with that question with the first definition, and it was never going to be that. So I do think we are getting distracted by the notion as to whether this is going to become legislation, because that really isn't the intention of the definition at all.
So as an overview, Charlotte, with your expertise, has this helped, or could it even do more damage than good? What are your views generally on this new definition? Is it going to improve matters?
It's going to help in the narrow area that I've already touched on. It's going to help in not giving money to the wrong organizations, and not engaging with the local authorities, for example, with organizations that are problematic. And it's something I've had a first-hand experience of. Very frustrating when you don't have a public list or something to go on to be able to work with local authorities and disengage them from these organizations. So that is useful. But extremism goes beyond groups and persons and individuals. Extremism online is pervasive. It's an idea, and it's no longer held in these clear pockets. So what we really need to be focusing on, and that's what this lacks, and it's a bit of a distraction, and it's clearly a play for votes ahead of the election. But what we really need to be focusing on is education, building resilient minds that engage in a multiplicity of ideas. Universities themselves are becoming places of radicalization because there's only one idea taught, a reading list with the same lecturers, the same academics over and over that have one view. We need to work on opening our young people's minds, making more resilient minds, more minds that engage in critical thinking, and also ensuring our schools are safely secular, that they are able to teach and they are protected from protests right at their gates and intimidation of teachers still in hiding from death threats. A lot of work around the blasphemy agenda. This is an implementation approach that the government needs to be engaging in. I understand it is beginning to implement Shawcross's recommendations, but William Shawcross himself has said that the implementation is still lacking. And I think that's where we really need to be focusing. Although I do welcome a definition, I welcome a list, a public list, it's really not where the whole depth of work needs to be focused right now.